Welcome everyone to our webinar, Do SOCs Really Secure Your Cloud Assets? Our speaker today is Rajesh Gopinath, who comes with over 17 years of experience in cybersecurity, 14 of those years at Palladium. Rajesh has had a stint as the head of our SOC at Palladium and currently manages the pre-sales function as the global pre-sales head. Before we get started, if you have any questions for the Q&A sessions later, please submit them using the questions tab under your slides window. You can also download this webinar deck from attachments. The attachments is already available. To download, just click on the attachments tab to get your copy. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded, so all attendees will receive a link to the webcast within 24 hours. Now, it's my pleasure to welcome your speaker, Rajesh Gopinath. Rajesh, over to you.
Thank you, Shrikant. Thank you for that introduction. So I will share my screen now. Can you confirm if you are able to see my screen?
Not yet, Rajesh. We can see your screen now.
Okay. Thank you. So, good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to this session. I appreciate the time you've taken to come to our session and listen about this topic. Over the next 30 minutes, I will cover key aspects of detecting threats and responding to threats in your cloud infrastructure. But before we begin, I'd like to set some context, especially around how the cloud threat landscape looks like. So we'll cover some of the common security threats that we have been seeing targeting cloud in the past few years. It's a well-kept secret that cybercriminals are almost always one step ahead. So the attacks on cloud infrastructure have not started now, but it's been happening since many years. So those were the times when cloud was restricted to AWS and Microsoft was just starting to struggle and get their cloud strategy. But today the story is really different. In a recent report by Intel, it stated that people who trust public cloud now outnumber those who don't by a ratio of 2:1. So this definitely means people are more comfortable with cloud. They are moving towards migrating the data centers to cloud. So with more adoption, we can see increased security threats, which is very evident from the threats that we have seen over the past few years. Cyber criminals have really matured, and they're now really focusing on attacks on market leaders like AWS and Azure, which is where most of the cloud assets are today. So what we'll do in this presentation or in this session is take a look at some of the breaches that have happened in the past years. And we'll then, in the second half of the session, we'll talk about some of the detection techniques and, of course, how to create a proper incident response plan for your security operations centers. So, so what you see are some of the most common attacks on cloud, right? So imagine that the attacker takes over your console account. Unlike compromises such as email, a cloud console account can create devastating results for organizations who use cloud a lot. The same thing happens with golden image compromise. Today, DevOps is pretty common, and we say if you see an attacker compromising a golden image in a Docker repository, that can lead to the entire repository getting compromised. So we'll take some examples of these attacks and see what were the reasons for those breaches. And moving on, we'll talk about some of the detection techniques. So cloud console takeover. So in this specific example, attackers took over the AWS console account of CodeSpaces and asked for ransom. Now, CodeSpaces was a project management and a JIT hosting company where you could upload your code for DevOps. It started with a DDoS attack, which later we found out was a diversion. The attacker actually had compromised AWS EC2 instances and left a message for ransom. The company did try to change passwords for accounts without realizing that the attacker had backup accounts. Later, the attacker went on to delete their code repositories, backups, and instances and other resources. Now, at that time when the attack happened, it was in the news, but today we see these attacks are all the more common. The other attack is around leaky S3 buckets, and this is probably one of the most talked about attacks that we've seen. So weak storage configuration has become one of the most common reasons leading to sensitive data exposure. We've seen many examples of critical data lying around in S3 buckets, which is accessible to the public. Now, this is really not surprising. Since there are so many features and components in cloud, it becomes very easy for us to overlook these configurations. The fact that AWS and Azure release more than 500 features in a year is not helping. What this means that you have to deal with a change almost every day. Now, these configuration changes that come with these feature changes can actually lead to insecure configuration, and catching up is not easy. When you launch a feature or a new feature, you may inadvertently include a misconfiguration that could lead to a public access of a storage bucket. So one of the most talked about breaches last year was that of Capital One, which happened in the year in July of 2019. Over 100 million credit card applications, including social security and bank account numbers, were leaked. So this is just one of many examples where we have seen leaky S3 buckets being a cause of data exposure. Another incident is another type of attack is cloud DDoS extortion. So we've seen so with cloud, attackers have a lot more power to carry out DDoS attacks, and these can be extensively harmful for primarily mid-tier SaaS companies when you carry out attacks of more than, let's say, 1 terabytes of traffic, and we've seen that in many cases. So the attack probably started in 2016 with the attack on DYN. And since then, attacks have evolved that use more than 1+ terabytes of traffic. It is becoming increasingly easier for attackers to use this as a method of extortion. This also becomes a mechanism for diversion. Now, we saw that when we spoke about the CodeSpaces incident, where the attacker used a DDoS attack to as a diversionary mechanism to gain access to the console. So these attacks are becoming increasingly common in today's environment. Email compromise has also been a major attack vector. Last year, we saw many of our customers complaining about email compromises. Now, our customers had subscribed to security features such as phishing and anti-spam services from Microsoft through their E3 licenses for O365. But even then, all of these cases were reported. We started the investigation, and we saw that the attackers are using a concept called zero font. Now, in this case, the attacker inserts a text into email with a zero font size. Now, this confuses natural language processing features used by Microsoft. But to the end user, it comes out as a properly formatted email. So it becomes easy to bypass filters, but it becomes very easy to trick users into clicking those links and those suspicious emails. So as you can see, phishing attacks have evolved. we see a number of attacks that have the context of the organization in the emails. They use short URLs to evade security measures. Using short URLs, it becomes very difficult to catch it using threat intelligence. So they use all of these diversionary bypassing features to get past the security controls and target users. So we've seen many attacks that lead to fund transfers. For example, fund transfers are carried out to attacker accounts posing as vendors. We see compromised accounts being used to send bursts of emails to other companies, essentially acting as a spam. And today it's all the more become prevalent, in the sense the current pandemic situation has led to a high amount of cloud-based email compromises. In fact, earlier this year, FBI released a warning, over cloud-based business email compromise scams, and we can see this trend to grow. So far, I believe it was reported that more than 2 billion, in terms of $2 billion US dollars was lost as part of these business email compromise scams, and the trend continues to be there in other countries as well. Some of the more evolving attacks are attacks on containers. So here's an example of the importance of container security. Now, in this case, the hacker managed to gain unrestricted access to a Docker Hub database, and we see that container technologies are being more popular. And with as it becomes more and more popular, we can see more and more attacks that target containers. So what we saw so far was some of the examples of attacks. So we saw attacks on console, we saw attacks on SaaS applications such as O365. We've seen even attacks on Docker images and repositories. So this is definitely worrying, and as organizations move towards cloud is still very new to many organizations. So we are still learning a lot of the cloud security practices. But as adoption increases, security is definitely going to be a challenge for most organizations. And as you can see, organizations are really in a catch-up mode. Who is responsible for security is not very clear. The confusion around the shared responsibility security model has resulted in cybersecurity incidents, and we saw that in the previous examples. So a lack of clarity on who is responsible on what part of the cloud infrastructure has led to real consequences in many enterprises, including introduction of malware and loss of data and many such attacks. So as you can see from the slide, there are varying opinions from customer teams regarding cloud security. So for example, 33% of IT teams feel that organizations are not committed to cloud security, whereas 1/3 of security team feel that it is their responsibility, but the majority of the team, which is 2/3, don't feel that it's their responsibility. So you can see that there is a lot of confusion around who is responsible for managing cloud security, and this in turn is a boon for attackers. They take advantage of this and try to carry out attacks. And an attack on cloud can actually be vicious because it gives a lot more access to the attackers in terms of data and infrastructure. So the result of all of this is that most organizations today are at a very high risk. So what you see here is information from various analysts regarding the risk that cloud brings to organizations. Now, change in the cloud is happening at a rapid pace. I mentioned earlier that more than 500 features are being released every year by Amazon, so AWS and Azure. Now, so many changes can cause a lot of issues. We spoke about that in the initial section of this session. But at the same time, the increasing threat landscape adds to the complexities in managing cybersecurity for cloud. To add that, as I mentioned, it is still not clear. Many organizations are not clear who is responsible for managing different aspects of cloud security. What is the responsibility of the CSP versus what is the responsibility of the organization, and all of this adds to the risks that organizations face. So in the next half of the presentation, I'm going to throw some light on some of the things that we need to do better in terms of detection and in terms of responding to attacks faster. When it comes to cloud, we have to look at both the cloud infrastructure and cloud applications. The adoption of both has increased tremendously over the last few years. So my examples in this current session is primarily going to be around Azure and AWS, but similar concepts can be applied to other cloud providers like Google. At the same time, we also seen a heavy adoption in cloud applications such as O365 and Salesforce and many other SaaS-based applications. We've seen a lot of user accounts getting compromised, and these accounts being used for suspicious activities and account transfers and fund transfers. As we saw in the case of email compromise, it was an O365 email account that was compromised, which was then later used to trick users into transferring funds. So as organizations, we have to give equal importance to both the cloud infrastructure as well as the cloud applications. So what do we monitor, right? So what you see on the screen are examples of cloud resources that can be monitored to detect similar threats that we saw in the beginning of the session. Now, you may not have to monitor all of it, but you will need to definitely monitor certain key elements of your cloud infrastructure, and some of the important ones are listed over here. For example, the activity details can be monitored using Azure console logs. Activities happening within the virtual machine, to your databases, to your containers. All this can be seen from respective logs that we collect from these specific components. So, for example, from console logs gives you a visibility of all administrative activities happening in your tenant. Although not listed here, flow logs such as VPC logs can capture network level activity and connections and connections among all the nodes in that virtual private network. So it captures inbound connections, network connections from external IP addresses, traffic produced in the internal network, and connections between microservices. So these flow logs can be used for detecting external attacks such as port scans, internal attacks such as suspicious movements between workloads, and many such attacks. So the same thing applies to AWS. Whatever resources that we see for Azure, we have similar resources on AWS, and the same concept applies. We can use logs from these resources to monitor for the similar threats that we have for Azure. So AWS has console logs. From an identity perspective, we can monitor the identity and access management logs, and database logs to look at database-based attacks, and similarly many other attacks. So yeah, before we move on to examples of attack, there are certain resources that these providers, Azure and AWS, provide for monitoring. For example, Azure provides log analytics. It's a log aggregation solution wherein you can collect all the logs from your cloud resources. Examples are listed on the screen. And from log analytics, you can then create your own rules for threat detection. AWS, however, provides two modules. One is called AWS CloudTrail. CloudTrail is basically used to monitor console activity logs, and CloudWatch is used to monitor activities within these resources. For example, activities happening on instances or databases or other cloud resources. So while these are solutions provided by Azure, you also have another way of extracting logs is through storage buckets or storage accounts in Azure and S3 buckets in AWS. We could configure all your cloud resources to send logs to a storage bucket or a storage account, and from there you could extract these logs because these storage accounts act as a centralized log aggregation point. from where you can define rules and other techniques to identify threats within your cloud environment. So we know that there are multiple techniques for threat detection, but the primary of which is to use rules and SIM use cases. So what you see here is certain examples of different components, and you can use these use cases to identify known threats. So there are use cases corresponding to different components that is being monitored. Now, in the initial part of this session, we spoke about cloud console takeover attacks. Now, we can detect similar threats using some of the use cases here. For example, access to the console from suspicious geographies or blacklisted IP addresses. It can be this use case can be identified specifically if you're not doing business in a geography, if you don't have users, if most of your users are confined to a single country. So you could define access from certain countries as suspicious, and definitely access from a blacklisted IP should definitely be considered as a suspicious activity. Now, these use cases can help identify a possible attempt, but how can you detect if an account is already compromised? Now, let's say your AWS console is already compromised and is being used by attackers to log in and to make changes. So one of the ways of doing it is to look at access to the console from two different geographies. So as you can see, one of the use cases in this slide talks about alerting if a same user logs in from two different geographies in a 4-hour window. Now this is highly suspicious, and first it's a console activity. You may not have too many console admins who have this access, and if an access has happened between a very short window from two different geographies, let's say from India and from, let's say, US, it can be treated as highly suspicious in nature. So that's an example of identifying an account that has already been compromised. The same logic can be used for O365, and which has been one of a very successful model for us to identify email compromises. So we use use cases that detect logins from two geographies in a short span of time, and we've been successful in detecting possible email compromises. Another example from an email compromise perspective is to detect a sudden burst of emails, let's say in 30 minutes. Now, this can indicate a possible compromise where the attacker is trying to send out spam or phishing emails from your account. While these are a few examples, there are many more threats that we can detect using rules. For example, we can detect port scan using flow logs. We can detect access from blacklisted sources also from flow logs and other logs. We can look at detecting critical activities on databases. For example, if somebody deletes a database or does some critical activities on the database, those things can be identified from relevant log sources within your cloud infrastructure. So as I discussed earlier, there are different mechanisms for identifying, there are different log collection mechanisms. And this is a summary of what each vendor provides. So what you have here is Azure providing log analytics for collecting logs of all types of logs, and CloudTrail for console activity, and CloudWatch for monitoring events from other cloud resources. So there are other techniques. One of the techniques that I discussed earlier in the session was to use storage buckets or S3 buckets. Now these buckets can act as storage accounts can act as a centralized repository from where we pull. So at Palladian, we use this technique. We have found this technique to work very well. We connect with both Azure and storage accounts to collect events and run them through our analysis engines to identify known attacks and unknown attacks through machine learning models and other techniques. So we'll talk about that in the coming slides. So what we discussed so far is how to use rules to detect known threats. So we discussed certain examples of identifying threats using rules and SIM use cases. So everything cannot be detected using rules, and it's a known industry problem that rules cannot detect everything. So here's a quadrant framework for scenarios and detection methods used. Right? Now you can see that there are technologies out there that can identify known attacks and also identify attacks originating from known threat actors. So you have threat intelligence that can identify attacks from known threat actors, and you can use threat intelligence and correlate that information from within your security products, such as an IDS or an antivirus or a SIM or any other alerting technology. And you have these technologies like DLPs and antivirus and EDR solutions that use signature based and rules to detect known attacks. But the blind spot here is, of course, what is the unknown part, and this is where artificial intelligence can really help. In a recent report by Oracle and KPMG, it stated that more than half of the respondents today use machine learning technologies for cybersecurity. And I believe that is the right way to go ahead, because cloud generates a lot of volume of alerts, a lot of data. It's humanly impossible to span through all that data and identify the right set of threats. And it definitely requires a machine and artificial intelligence to identify those kind of threats. So what can we do? So AI can be applied on non-alert data. For example, we can apply it on logs such as proxy, NetFlow, and DNS traffic, Active Directory, and many other sources. So using AI on these data sources can increase the detection of unknown threats and can lead to detecting attacks such as hidden malware, backdoors, insider threats, and many such attacks. So I'll take one example of how we were able to identify an attack using a machine learning model. Now, this was a case where there was an insider who had a knowledge about the organization security controls. For example, what kind of content filters are used, the DLP technologies that are used. With this knowledge, the attacker, the insider, used a software to split data into very small pieces of information and started uploading that into a microblogging website. Now, social media sites were allowed by the content filters, and of course the DLP, because the data was of such small size, the DLP could not identify it as a sensitive data. So this technique is very difficult to detect using traditional rules and signatures. So and that is how you can use artificial intelligence to identify a behavior, an automated behavior of such a fashion from an internal source to an external source, and use that to identify suspicious activities. Similarly, so there are many cases where artificial intelligence has turned out to be a great asset for organizations. And as you can see, more than 50% of organizations that were part of that survey today trust machine learning techniques to identify more hidden attacks. Moving on, so while we spoke about detection, organizations today also need to focus on automating incident response. Now, the moment we identify a threat, if we can contain it quickly, it can greatly reduce the damage. So the same concept applies to both data center and cloud. The faster you contain a threat, the lower the damage. So let's say you get an alert from an IPS or an alert source, and what we need to do is quickly validate it, try to identify what was the attacker doing, what was the source doing, analyze what is the impact on the asset, try to find out if there are any other systems that could have been affected. For example, in this case, is the particular workload communicating to any other workloads in your cloud environment? Or and have we seen any other attack campaigns from the same IP address? So a quick way of analyzing, especially using automation to do that, can greatly help in reducing the time to contain that attack. Finally, if you also have certain automation techniques to contain the threat, for example, if you can temporarily shut down the workload if you identify a specific attack originating from a workload. That can stop the spread of the attack. So there could be many containment measures that we can take to quickly contain the attack before it causes the damage. And for that reason, runbooks have become very popular. Organizations today are focusing on creating runbooks. Today, many of those runbooks are documented and executed manually, but the focus has always been to automate the execution. We can use AI also as part of the runbooks. It can be used to identify new scenarios, take actions quickly based on certain presets and conditions. And it's, as I said, one of the examples is used to prevent traffic from a particular workload if it's deemed to be compromised. So there are many solutions out there, but at the same time, Azure and AWS also provide certain automation modules which can be leveraged by third parties to automate these runbooks, including organizations as yourselves can use that to automate your incident response. So some of those tools that are provided by Azure and AWS are listed over here. So Azure uses automation runbooks and Azure Functions and O365 flows. And AWS has modules such as System Manager Automation, Lambda, and System Manager Run Commands. So these are some of the tools that are available and have been leveraged by some of the organizations to automate their runbooks. So this is what we have been talking so far. We spoke about detection first, how we can use secure rules, signature-based techniques to identify known threats. We also discussed a few examples on how to detect threats on console on cloud console and similar threats. We also spoke about how we can use machine learning for threat hunting. So threat hunting is an important aspect of threat detection, where it can greatly improve the security posture by identifying threats that can bypass traditional rules and SIM use cases. So that there should definitely be a consideration for organizations looking to adopt cloud and organizations who want to improve their security posture by using machine learning techniques. So we also detect how threat intelligence plays an important role in threat detection. Threat intel can be used both in rules and also machine learning models to identify if there is some kind of access from a known attacker or a known IP address or a known bad IP address or a domain. So this can be easily used to identify attacks originating from known attackers. We also spoke about the importance of response, how important it is to analyze incidents quickly. Things such as identifying other systems that could be affected by the same attacker, what the attacker has been doing, what the source has been doing. So all these questions should be answered quickly and analyzed so that we can take the next logical step, which is to contain the threat. And we discussed how we can use automation and some of the tools that both Azure and AWS provides to carry out these auto containment measures. And finally, we use the lessons learned from these exercises to recover from the incident, to ensure that future incidents can be prevented, and of course to overall improve the cyber security posture. So in summary, while the threats to cloud are manifold, there are techniques that can be used to help detect threats on cloud, and there are solutions available using which you can provide fast incident response. And these should be really considered by organizations who are looking to move towards cloud or who are already on the cloud and are planning to expand. Before I conclude, a quick overview about Palladium. So we are a cybersecurity firm, focused cybersecurity firm, providing only cybersecurity services for over 19 years now. We are a pretty large team. We are more than 1,000 plus cybersecurity experts. We have been providing SOC services for over 15 years, and we have security operations centers across 6 geographies across the globe. We provide next generation SOC services, managed detection and response services, using our patented AI platform called Isaac. We'll be more than happy to answer any questions, or if you want to know more about our services, you can drop us a mail, and we'll be more than happy to help you out. With that, I conclude today's session, and I'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Rajesh. That was very insightful. So we have quite a few questions here, actually. So we will try and take up as many as possible. So the first one from James: how can we spot anomalous activities by users on my cloud services, specifically SaaS applications?
Right. So we discussed a few cases. Thank you, James, for that question. During the session, we discussed a few examples of detecting users. SaaS applications definitely have a lot of threats when it comes to user accounts. And we discussed a few examples on how you can use these user logs or activity logs or access logs from these SaaS applications to identify threats, anomalous activities by users. So some of the examples we discussed was, if somebody logs in from 2 different geographies in a short span of time, that can be deemed as suspicious. And if you see an email account being used to send out a lot of, let's say, thousands of emails in a short span of time, that can be considered as a suspicious attack. We can also use machine learning techniques. For example, what we do is we collect access information or login information from these SaaS applications. We profile the login activity of these users. And if we see that profile change of any of those user accounts or email accounts, then we know that it is possibly suspicious in nature. And we then move on to investigate and see if it in fact is a real threat or not. So there are ways and means to do that. I hope I've answered your question.
Okay. Yeah, I think so, Rajesh. So we have 2 questions from Munesh Ahuja that just came in. I will get back to your earlier questions. What is your view on SIEM tools from cloud vendors like Microsoft, Sentinel? Should we integrate with existing one? And how does one manage misconfiguration in cloud? So that's a 2-part question.
Yes. So the first question is, so the first question, if I understand, is what is my opinion about cloud SIM solutions? I believe the reference is towards Microsoft Azure Sentinel and Guard Duty from AWS. Now, while these technologies are good, finally these are technologies. You would still need somebody to manage these solutions and to make sense of all the alerts that come from these products. So if you have the bandwidth and the time, it's a solution to be considered. But based on my experience, there are certain I would say weaknesses, if I can say that. Specifically, if you're using a hybrid kind of a data center, let's say if you have a physical data center with many assets, and if you have, let's say, a hybrid cloud environment with cloud resources both in, let's say, AWS and Azure, there's not a lot of support provided for integration, and that has been a challenge that we have seen. So it is definitely your call. I think if you see that there are resources that are readily supported by Sentinel, it's definitely something that you can consider. But if you have a hybrid environment, and if you have if you use different cloud providers, then you may have to look at a solution that can consume data from all of these sources. But the end of it, it is finally a SIM technology. You would still need to manage it. You would still need somebody to monitor the alerts, fine tune the use cases, prepare runbooks. So you would still need to have somebody to manage and derive outcome or benefits from the solution.
Thanks, Rajesh. We have a few more. So this is from James Hicker. We take services from third parties who use either Azure or AWS to provide their services. What type of certifications should we look for in a third party?
So I think that's a good question. We've actually seen a lot of attacks that have originated from third parties. So it's important to ensure that the third party service providers that you use have the necessary certifications to provide you that service. So some of the common certifications are, of course, the ISO 27001. This is a very generic certification which ensures that the organization follows security best practices for different areas, or different controls. The other one would be the SOC reports, the SOC 1, SOC 2, and SOC 3 reports. The SOC 2 and SOC 3 reports focus on controls pertaining to security, availability, integrity, and confidentiality. So, in fact, SOC 2 also, examines the details of the data center security and its operational effectiveness. So these two certifications can be really helpful. But if you are an organization, or if the third party is dealing with, let's say, personal information, personally identifiable information, another certification that you can look at is the ISO 27018 certification, which is specifically around controls for protecting personal information on the cloud. And then finally, you also have the Cloud Security Alliance STAR certification, which looks at controls across what they call as cloud controls matrix, and that's a good certificate also to have. Yeah.
Thanks, Rajesh. So we have one very detailed question and a very specific one from Mahesh P. So since this is quite specific to their environment, we will respond back on an email, Mahesh. So we have another one from Tapas Day. How do you detect data infiltration involving new employees bringing data from previous organization? What is the potential risk involved?
Okay. So insider attacks are always very difficult to detect, especially when you depend on traditional technologies such as rules and assign use cases for threat detection. So that is where machine learning can be really helpful. So if you're able to profile a user behavior, and if you can profile if that behavior changes, or if that user's behavior is very different from a peer group, you then have a point of investigation. It there definitely will be thrown out as an anomaly, and that anomaly can be further investigated to find out what is the risk this particular user brings in. So definitely, usage of AI and machine learning techniques can be used for such kind of cases.
Thanks, Rajesh. Okay, the last one, we are running out of time. Are there any specific use cases for the cloud to monitor a large remote workforce? I think this is very relevant for the current situation we are in. Rajesh, you want to take that?
Definitely. That's a very good question. So today, because of the pandemic situation, you see remote users moving, to their homes, connecting from home and from different geographies. So many of those security, use cases that we had may not work for such an environment. For example, we also made some changes in the way we detect. We had certain models that were based on IP addresses to detect abnormal activity from users. Now today, when users started moving to their homes with dynamic IP addresses, it's very difficult to detect those behaviors. So we changed those use cases from IP based to user based, and then those user anomalies were identified through those user account information. And when the remote workforce is there, it's not just you can also use cases for your remote infrastructure, your VPN devices, your firewalls that allow access to the remote infrastructure. These logs can also be used to identify threats originating from remote users.
Thanks a lot, Rajesh. That was, I hope, we answered your questions there. We did take as many questions as possible, but, there were a few more that we could not answer. We will try to respond to you on email, so you can expect a response from us soon. If there are any more questions, please feel free to write to us. There is an email provided in the invite that was sent out. And like we said earlier, the presentation can be downloaded as a copy, so it is available in attachment. And the recording of this session will be sent to you within 24 hours. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. And with that, we will conclude.